Welcome back, everyone. My name is John Horodisky, and I will be the chair for track 2. And welcome to Dam and Heritage Cultural Permissions with the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa. If you are looking for a dam for all season, Mediabank's criteria for change with Mediabank, please scroll to the top of the agenda and click track 1. For this is the amazing track 2. And remember, with the presentation, please send your questions to the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll be monitoring those for the rest of the presentation. And without further ado, I would love to introduce my esteemed colleague, Nicola Caldwell from the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa. Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, John. Kia ora koutou, everyone. My name is Nicola Caldwell, and I'm the Digital Asset System Manager here at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa, and I'm coming to you from Wellington, New Zealand. So today I'm going to talk to you about digital asset management and cultural permissions. Sorry, here we go. So in my presentation today, I'm going to talk about why cultural permissions are important to Te Papa, how we represent our cultural permissions within our digital asset management system, why good working relationships are essential and how we go about fostering them. And I will finish with some questions for you to ponder as digital asset management professionals. So before I begin, just some quick notes on language. Te reo Māori is the Indigenous language of New Zealand and is recognised here as an official language. I will be using Māori terms throughout this presentation. As I go, I will endeavour to provide translations or context, but it's worth introducing a few of them here with some basic translations. So Māori is an Indigenous New Zealander. Pākehā is a New Zealander of European descent. Iwi is an extended kinship group, tribe, nation, or people. Taonga can be translated as a treasure or object. Mātauranga is knowledge, wisdom, and understanding or skill. And tikanga is a custom or protocol. Please note and forgive that these are very brief and simplified translations of the terms, and they have much greater richness and complexity in their language. So let's delve into why cultural permissions are important for the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa. So Te Papa is New Zealand's national museum, and it is a Crown entity, meaning that it receives funding from and is answerable to the New Zealand government. As a Crown entity, we are bound by New Zealand's founding document, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi, that was signed in 1840 by representatives of the British Crown and Māori chiefs. There are 3 articles that can be summarised as ensuring Māori partnership, participation and protection under British rule. The treaty is a contentious document, the ramifications of which are still being worked through. And sadly, there's not enough time in this presentation to cover that in any depth, but the treaty is essential in understanding our museum context. The museum was founded a few decades after the treaty was signed in 1865 and has gone through several name changes and iterations in the intervening years. Our current identity as Te Papa was brought about by the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa Act of 1992. And the building itself that we're in now opened in 1998. This new museum was founded to reflect the changing society, values and diversity of New Zealand and has a strong focus on Indigenous partnership and participation. Section 8 of the Act states that in its performance of functions, the board of the museum shall have regard to the ethnic and cultural diversity of the people of New Zealand and the contributions they have made and continue to make to New Zealand's cultural life and the fabric of New Zealand society. And they will endeavour to ensure both that the museum expresses and recognises the mana and significance of Māori, European and other major traditions and cultural heritages, and that the museum provides the means for every such culture to contribute effectively to the museum as a statement of New Zealand's identity. Typical ways that Te Papa gives expression to this legislation include maintaining and caring for one of the world's largest and most significant collections of taonga Māori, applying museum practices concerning the care, conservation, interpretation, curation, and display of taonga Māori that makes appropriate use of mātauranga Māori or Māori knowledge and tikanga Māori or Māori customs. It ensures the visible and dynamic presence of Māori language and culture in the front of house experiences, including the building and exhibition signage, wayfinding, public programming, and more. It is committed to the effective and meaningful collaborations with iwi and Māori communities in the care, interpretation, and display of taonga Māori. The reason for an ongoing emphasis on the mana and significance of Māori cultural tradition arises from a number of issues, including that New Zealand museums first developed in a time where alienation and disenfranchisement of culture, particularly material culture, from Māori people was taking place. In large and small ways, New Zealand museums benefited from the alienation of the culture from iwi and Māori communities. There has been a history of interpreting Māori material culture and taonga in ways that served the colonisation of iwi rather than giving voice and expressing the culture and worldview that saw the creation of those taonga and material culture. As a Crown entity, Te Papa participates in treaty settlement processes, including repatriation through the Karanga Aotearoa repatriation program. And the museum ensures there is appropriate care for and access to taonga Māori for taonga within its care. Te Papa also provides sector support and training for iwi communities and smaller cultural institutions to be able to look after their treasures within their source communities. The work of decolonising or indigenising our museum is really important to me as an Aotearoa New Zealand museum professional. And while this can be a challenging area, it is imperative to address this history and take action to honour our treaty partnership in all areas of our work and lives. Te Papa was founded on principles of biculturalism, which describes the equal treaty partnership between Māori and Pākehā, and Mana Taonga, which recognises the spiritual and cultural connections of taonga or treasures to their people through their ancestry or whakapapa. This concept recognises the whakapapa or ancestry through the creator of specific taonga, the ancestors after whom taonga is named, and the whānau, hapu, or iwi to whom the taonga is an heirloom. Mana Taonga is central in laying the foundation for Māori participation and involvement in Te Papa. The concept was developed through consultation with iwi and other stakeholders in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and was endorsed by the Museums Board in 1992. The rights acknowledged in the Mana Taonga principle accord iwi the mana to care for their taonga, to speak for them, and to determine their use or uses by the museum. The rights of Mana Taonga cannot be erased and continue to exist for those taonga held within the museum's care. In a practical sense, Mana Taonga provides iwi and communities with the right to define how taonga within Te Papa should be cared for and managed in accordance with their tikanga or custom. As a cultural institution, Te Papa holds a dynamic and diverse array of relationships with external groups. These partnerships and stakeholders can include iwi and hapu groups, research partners, community groups, other institutions, lenders, artists, donors, government agencies, as well as the general public. Something to note here is that we use our digital asset management system to store all of our non-collection media assets, and our collection-related media assets, like those that you would see in our Collections Online website, are managed within our collections management system. So our DAMS includes media assets associated with such things as events and programs, exhibitions, marketing, publicity and branding, behind-the-scenes museum work, and field trips and outreach. Due to the nature of this kind of material, the assets often feature people, works, and places that include our stakeholders and their cultural interests. Therefore, when thinking about the implementation of our dams, one of the requirements was the ability to capture and document the museum's relationships with external parties and their associated permissions within the system. So, how do we represent those cultural permissions and Māori authority over Taonga assets within our digital asset management system? We have 5 mandatory metadata fields which control the reuse status of all our assets. These are the owner of the media asset, the copyright holder, iwi clearance, contributor release, and location release. The iwi clearance and contributor release are what we use to describe what I'll term as our cultural permissions for media assets. The ownership and copyright are Western principles of law that don't necessarily recognise the cultural authority that Māori hold over representations of Taonga works. And therefore, the museum had to come up with a way to raise the visibility of Indigenous cultural and moral authority over the use of assets in order to uphold the values of the Treaty of Waitangi and the Mana Taonga principle. Iwi clearance is used anytime an asset includes Māori Taonga, and this can include objects, art, practices, and intangible heritage. In this way, the museum gives equal weight to iwi clearance alongside ownership of the asset and the copyright. The iwi must be contacted every time we want to use an asset that includes Taonga, and this ensures that Māori communities have control over when and how cultural heritage is represented, used, and made visible in the public domain. Their wishes can be respected in perpetuity and evolve with time. These steps aim to ensure that Māori agency over assets and respect their right to decide on permissions depending on the context for each request, rather than giving a blanket permission. Contributor release is used anytime there is another party that we may require permission from to reuse the assets. This could include a model, a lender, performer, or contributor. We have a specific metadata set for iwi clearance, which is available to all staff to view within our dams. And this includes such fields as the iwi name, which records who we need to seek permission from if we want to reuse the asset, an acknowledgement field, so that iwi can choose how they wish to be acknowledged in the caption and credit lines that are automatically generated. We can link out to documents in our records management system that record any interaction we've had with the iwi group and any signed permissions or contracts. We can record permissions for specific use or project use only. We also have a clearance status, which can include things such as pending, current, expired, cancelled, or declined. And we also have fields for clearance terms, restrictions, and research notes, so that users can quickly understand what, if any, reuse is possible. Typically, the contributor release set is used to describe the relationships with people who participate in our public programs and events and other institutions or artists who lend works for our exhibitions. Surprisingly, this set is the most used within the system as it is capable of describing many kinds of relationships with external parties. It holds the details for such things as model releases for marketing and publicity images, agreements with lenders for borrowed artworks, or with other institutions for photographs of touring exhibitions that are held at Te Papa. Performers or contributors depicted at public programs, events, and release forms, or release from copyright holders for works depicted within the media assets, for example, in exhibition installation shots. Similar to the iwi clearance metadata set, the contributor release set is used to record the external parties, their contact details, acknowledgement if necessary, release status, terms, and period, any restrictions, for example, for non-commercial use or project use only, and any fees associated, any other notes, and a related collection item number if relevant. So it's all about the people. In this section, I will talk about why good working relationships are essential to collaboration and user adoption and organizational buy-in. When working with iwi and cultural partners, collaboration and shared authority is essential. Te Papa is in partnership with Māori groups and communities, and this is woven through our practices, policies, values, legislation, and strategies. Trust is paramount for fostering productive working relationships and engagement with Indigenous communities. The museum's iwi relationships team help facilitate those conversations around reuse of media assets containing Māori content. They're specialists in working with iwi groups and hold knowledge of Mātauranga Māori and Tikanga Māori. Te Papa has a desire to correct the imbalance of power between the museum and Māori communities. This is especially important given the context of the Treaty of Waitangi, the treaty claims, growing recognition of Indigenous rights, and the awareness raised through protests such as Black Lives Matter. It is essential for the museum to give genuine agency and control to those with cultural authority to make those decisions. Metadata and documentation rely on a network of people across the organization recording and entering information into our digital asset management system. We have content producers are provided with training and access to empower the use of dams so they can upload valuable content and provide contextual information about relationships within the metadata. These content creators include groups such as the public programs and events teams, marketing and communications, the digital and exhibition content producers, our imaging team, and curatorial teams. Internal collaboration and understanding between the creators, uploaders, and support or oversight teams is essential. I work very closely with our rights manager to check the quality of metadata and that the reuse status against the assets is correct. We work together to educate and reinforce good metadata standards with the content creators and uploaders. As I said earlier, the iwi relationships team manages the clearance of any images with Taonga Māori or iwi groups featured within them. And the information and records team helps facilitate the storage and retrieval of documentation kept within our document and records management system. This can include contracts, model release forms, and email exchanges providing terms and further context to the assets. Our user adoption strategies that we use include having a simple and easy to understand traffic light indicator on assets for reuse status. For example, if iwi clearance or a contributor release is required, then the reuse status will be red or amber, depending on the permissions the parties have given and the circumstances of the potential use of the asset. This reuse status allows all staff to get a quick handle on which assets require further clearance, and then they can drill further down into the specific metadata sets in order to understand the relationships and permissions further. Staff have self-service access to the assets and metadata, and we make it clear that they are responsible for checking and seeking permissions where necessary. I provide in-person training sessions and have developed an e-learning module to provide training options to suit different learning preferences, schedules, and needs. I've also developed a variety of user guides, quick reference guides, and solutions. And I send out a monthly newsletter with tips and tricks, information about updates, and how we're using the system. We have an online service desk where people can lodge requests for help and advice. This also allows us to track statistics for services provided. There are a range of document templates for contracts and model release or performer agreement forms, which include intellectual property clauses and seek explicit permissions for reuse of media assets. As an organization, there are a number of initiatives to increase our cultural competencies, our understanding of the Te Tiriti Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, as well as having policies such as biculturalism and mana taonga. And as employees, we are bound by these through our code of conduct and our professional responsibility to the sector and to the public. So to finish, I will leave you with a couple of questions that I haven't answered myself, but I ask myself. What is your moral and professional responsibility to Indigenous or community partners? And how can your organisation safeguard and represent cultural authority within your dam systems and metadata? Thank you. So I will stop sharing and we can take questions.
Excellent. Nicola, that was an excellent presentation. I definitely will be making a trip virtually and in person as soon as I can. I learned a lot, and there are lots of good questions coming your way, so well done. So
Sure.
let's, to be mindful of time, we've got about 7 minutes left before we go to the next session, so I'm gonna try and get through as many of these as we can, okay? So number one,
Sure.
For you, Nicola, how do you manage iwi clearance where multiple iwi identify as having interest in the asset?
Then we have to go back to each of those individual iwi groups is the short answer. Also, our iwi relationships team is in contact with a lot of iwi groups around the country, and they will understand the intricacies of those relationships and dynamics between different groups. And so we'll be able to manage and provide context around that as well. So yeah.
Ongoing, isn't it? It's just always.
It's absolutely ongoing, and it's really important that those groups have control over every instance where we want to reuse those assets. We don't want to get a blanket permission.
Another good question for you, Nicola. Are you planning on rolling these processes out to other cultures, such as Pacifica people, Asia, the Middle East?
So we do have quite a lot of public programs and things that involve communities from our Pacific neighbours, and we use similar kind of processes. Typically, it's the public programs team and our curators who hold those relationships with those communities, and we actually use the contributor release set to describe those relationships. So with either groups or particular individuals. We don't have a separate set for kind of other cultures, but we kind of use the contributor release in that way.
And the museums community is always quite collaborative, you know, a lot of organization, associations,
Absolutely.
so a lot of sharing for sure, right?
Yes, definitely. And we also, for exhibitions and things, we license content from all over the place. So we also use a lot of the rights and metadata sets to describe and control those relationships that we have.
Another good question for you, Nicola. I'd be interested to know the iwi clearance process outside the walls of the museum as well.
So I'm not actually part of those, so I probably can't answer that very well. Typically, our iwi relationships team will do a lot of correspondence via email and phone, but we also have a lot of people who come into the building, and Te Papa also hosts an iwi group through our iwi in residence program. So every few years we have a different group who have an exhibition within the museum and have some representatives who work with us for several years and can provide kind of clearance for that particular group while they're on site and have an ongoing relationship with the museum long term.
Excellent. Another good question. It's more of a comment, I think, but I think it's quite interesting. Hi, Nicola. Have you had a chance to read Paul Tapsell's Tonga, A Tribal Response to Museums?
I haven't, no, but it is on my reading list, and I appreciate the comment. I've definitely heard that it's
like we should all be reading that book. Well done.
Yeah, I've got so many things to read. Yeah, I'm just in the beginning of my journey, learning about a lot of these things, and in preparation for this presentation, also read one of the treaty settlement claims, which is all about sort of cultural rights over representations of Māori cultural heritage. For those who are in the New Zealand realm, the Y262 treaty claim, which for those in the know will know exactly what I mean.
Right.
Yeah.
This is such a great community. We're giving book suggestions to each other. I just love that. I think that's great. Another great question for you, Nicola. Is iwi data collected on separate forms or is it another process?
So we don't typically collect data on the iwi groups. We will just have their iwi name, so we know, well, we can let the iwi relationships team know who to go in contact within that group, because obviously over time that the contact people will change, so we have to kind of have an evolving relationship there. We might record a contact email address in the metadata if that's appropriate, but often it's kind of down to that relationships team to know who to contact, and they definitely know. They're awesome.
They probably do definitely know, yes.
Yeah.
We got about 2 more minutes to go. There's 2 more questions, so I think we might be able to get them done, Nicola. This one's kind of like a 2-parter, so we'll see how much we can do. The question is your metadata platform built in-house? Yes or no?
No. So we use an external vendor. We use a SaaS product. Yeah.
And that's what they were looking for. And they were wondering also, are your record fields customized for Te Papa's information keeping requirements?
Yes, absolutely. So we haven't customized our instance, but we are able to configure different metadata sets. So we have set up, or we use Dublin Core as often a basis for some of the normal metadata, but then for these particular types of metadata sets that we want to be able to record, we've sort of created those ourselves within the system. They are loosely based on our collections management system and how that records metadata as well. So we've got sort of a level of interoperability possible.
This last question, I think, could be an entire panel itself, and I hope that next year when we do Henry Stewart Dam Asia Pacific, we do this as a panel. And the question is, how do you present potentially culturally insensitive historical data in your system?
Okay, so that's probably more of a question for our collections management system manager. Our digital asset management system has been in a lot shorter period of time, so we don't typically have assets or metadata that isn't culturally sensitive anymore. And I realize that it kind of changes over time. And we do work with control vocabularies. I know in the collections management system, they kind of sort of archive or hide some of those less appropriate terms and update them to things that are more appropriate. So it's definitely living.
Yeah, it's a great question in terms of all that can be done within the heritage sector.
Really
I would like everyone to join me in thanking Nicola for this wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and I know I'm definitely going to be visiting very soon. So thank you very much, Nicola, for this.